This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris for the first conversation of the year, the new year, 2020. I'm tempted to make a 2020 vision joke having to do with worldview, but we've already defriended everyone on our social media feeds who've made all those 2020 jokes. So we'll move on to an enormous story, really something that's got, I think, everyone, I don't say everyone on edge, but certainly it's got entire nations on edge, which is the news that came out late Thursday that General Qasem Soleimani, who is the commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, after a whole holiday season of Iranian-backed forces, according to the U.S. government, Iranian-backed forces kind of inspiring protests at the U.S. Embassy and so on. But the General Qasem Soleimani, really the top military commander in Iran, being taken out by a missile attack in Iraq. Shane Morris, great to have you back for another year of conversations. This is a biggie. It's going to be really hard to know where this is going to go. People have likened it to the assassination that launched World War I. That might be a little melodramatic, but certainly the tensions between the U.S. and Iran were escalating quickly, but this has taken it to an entirely different level.
Well, John, I haven't even finished my supply of eggnog yet, and we're going to jump right into this, huh?
Well, yeah, we are going to jump into it, and it's really something. So one of the things that we have to talk about here, first of all, is that this is being talked about in some quarters as if it's kind of a one-off event. There really wasn't the BBC covered it and talked about kind of a dramatic escalation, quote, and the low-level conflict between the U.S. and Iran. One of the things we've got to remember is that conflict between the U.S. and Iran has been going on for quite a while in the region. And not only that, but there have been kind of a series of events over the last couple of years that if we don't put them all together, we don't kind of realize that this is kind of part of a larger story arch. Basically, low-level rocket attacks against U.S. bases in Iraq were blamed on Tehran. A civilian U.S. contractor was killed in those rocket attacks. There were earlier things against tankers in the Gulf, and I'm quoting here the BBC article, the shooting down of a U.S. unmanned aerial vehicle. We talked about that. You remember that? There was a drone shot down by Iran, and one of the things that was really interesting is that there was no retaliation by the U.S., and that was a surprising thing. And then, of course, a major attack against a Saudi oil facility that the U.S. has identified as Iranian-backed. But again, none of those things had a U.S. response. Now we had this kind of escalating tensions at the U.S. embassy in Iraq. Basically people calling it Trump's Benghazi, which obviously wasn't true at all because there was a much swifter response than what we saw with the Benghazi incident. But identifying that was Iranian-backed, and now that Soleimani was even in Iraq, that's the other key point, is that here you have a general from a hostile nation in a war theater. And we've got to remember, the U.S. has been in Iraq. We can say they've been there too long, that this war has gone on and on and on. But this, as David French pointed out, it was President Obama who deployed military forces there, and it, came with congressional authority. And, so this is taking place in a kind of a war arena for a foreign hostile like Soleimani to be there and to be orchestrating, according to the U.S., hostile actions against the U.S. That's the justification that the Pentagon is giving for these actions. And look, there's details that we don't know. That narrative certainly seems to make a lot of sense given all the facts. The question is how big of a tipping point, how big of a trigger is this going to be for the tensions between Iran and the U.S.?
Yeah, I don't think it's fair to characterize Soleimani as an Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This wasn't some sort of out-of-the-blue terrorist attack or an assassination in the typical sense. Like you said a moment ago, the U.S. has been fairly long-suffering on this, as far as I can tell, and our allies have as well. And this guy has been at the center of a great deal of ongoing escalation and hostilities in the region. So it's probably fair to see this as a blow in an ongoing conflict more than as an instigation of some new sort of conflict. I'll tell you what interests me most, John, is the question of what Christians ought to think of all this. I mean, foreign policy is a notoriously sticky area, and we had Mindy Bells on last week to talk about some of the issues in the region there in the Middle East. But how can we, bring moral principles to bear here? It turns out that, as we talked about on Breakpoint many times, there's a rich Christian tradition, usually called just war theory, that helps us to sort of parse out the morality and sort through the right and wrong of how nations engage in warfare, right?
Well, and that's what's so helpful about, again, and why it's so necessary to have a Christian worldview is that otherwise you'd be going incident by incident from scratch. Does this kind of justify my emotions at the moment? And that it's impossible not only to avoid that as an individual, but to avoid that as nation states. And so grounding actions into kind of deeper principles of justifiable of what sort of violent reaction is justified or violent actions are justified is absolutely necessary. And I'm not saying that just because people always quote just war theory that they're actually using it, in that sort of sense. But it has been.
We quoted it. The war is just.
Yeah, there we go. So it's done. No, and this one's a sticky point because just war theory has an awful lot of components to it, or justifiable actions like this have an awful lot of components to it. Now, we already mentioned that the U.S. cited all of kind of the past actions of Soleimani and Iranian hostility. They also cited the fact that they were kind of interrupting kind of current hostile plans. According to the Reuters headline, the U.S. says it disrupted a, quote, imminent attack. So that kind of adds to the whole, conversation as well. But let's walk through the principles of just war theory here quickly, just kind of as a reminder.
The initial principles proposed by Augustine, if I'm remembering correctly here, were a lawful authority has to be the one who wages or declares the war. It can't just be private actors. There has to be a good intention behind it, and he's very specific about that. It can't just be, we're going to make the world a better place by getting rid of these people. You have to be defending innocent life and seeking to preserve peace or restore peace. You have to have exhausted all other means. In other words, it can't be a first resort. War has to be a last resort after diplomacy and so forth. And that certainly fits this example. The United States has engaged in decades of sort of hard diplomacy with Iran, including sanctions, and the problem hasn't abated. And then we have to ask: is a war winnable? Can we actually prosecute this war and successfully bring it to victory? Is there a reasonable expectation of that, in other words? And then finally, there's proportional force. We have to ask whether what we're doing is justified given the provocation prior to that. So there, like you said, there are a lot of moving parts to just war theory. But if you think about these principles and look at their scriptural grounding, you see that they are grounded in justice and right and wrong and in the order that God set up when he instituted government to punish evil and reward good.
Yeah, so all of this kind of plays into it. Like you said, a lot of moving parts. Basically, have two sides of the just war kind of doctrine. One is, is there justifiable cause for hostile action? And two, are you going to wage that hostile action in a justifiable manner? And there's so many things that can go wrong with that, right, with that formula, Shane, and not to mention having a legitimate, authority in power. And of course, everyone now, quotes, that this is a justifiable use of force from both sides of the aisle all the time. And so what's difficult is continuing to do this sort of thing in a noble sort of manner when so much is at stake and so much is on the line. And, when you're dealing with a regime like in Iran, it is nearly impossible to predict those actions. What are they going to do? I'm not saying that taking out a Soleimani wasn't justified at all. It seems at face value to me to be justifiable, have been the right thing to do, to have been a very, very bold action on the part of the U.S. to kind of get ahead of what has become escalating tensions. Yet at the same time, I mean, what is this going to trigger? It is impossible to know. I agree. It's hyperbolic to compare this to an Archduke Ferdinand because Ferdinand and Soleimani aren't the same guy, at all. But at the same time, as a trigger, this could set off an awful lot of consequences that it's literally impossible to foresee.
I mean, we're recording this just ahead of the weekend, and going into the weekend, the question looming over us is: are we at war with Iran now? And we very well may be in a worse situation on that front by the time Saturday rolls around.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, we're considering, obviously, at the Colson Center, we put out a daily commentary Monday to Friday called Breakpoint. And if you listen to the Breakpoint podcast, you catch that each and every day. And, that's one of the difficult things is, for a Monday, airing, we recorded on Friday, and we were talking about even this morning, that between now and then, it might be very clear that we are at war with Iran. And it may be a completely different outcome, and it's almost impossible to know. I mean, the upside of this program, Shane, is that we're recording it Friday morning at 8:30 Mountain Time, 10:30 Eastern Time to be specific. We're giving you a little look here behind how the sausage is made, and it will be live later this afternoon. And so, pretty safe to say we may, even by the time this thing airs later on this afternoon, it may seem like what our conversation here is completely out of date. That's why it's so important, though, Shane, and this is what the Colson Center really we believe, and what we continue to say is we have to be operating from first principles. We can't be operating from he did this, so I'm going to do that, especially when we're talking about our thinking on issues like this of international, gravity. We've got to be clear on what we call a Christian worldview, having these kind of fundamental framework of our basic beliefs in place that are informed by Scripture and informed by God's revelation. Well, you're listening to Breakpoint this week, and we'll talk about the issues of the culture each and every week here from a Christian worldview. John Stonestreet, along with Shane Morris. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources, and you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Back on Breakpoint this week, John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Continuing our theme, Shane, tragically, of justifiable force. We go to a story much closer to home on Sunday, December the 29th, as many have seen the video, and it's an absolutely stunning account. After, by the way, a Saturday night attack in New York at a Hanukkah party of religious folk with a man wielding a machete. We had another act of violence in Texas where a lone gunman entered into West Freeway Church of Christ in a town called White Settlement, Texas, killed 2 people when a volunteer security member who's become kind of an international icon now, Jack Wilson, in a remarkable act of both courage and skill, ended that shooting. And it sparked off, again, kind of the gun debate in the U.S. I'm tempted, although, Shane, we've talked about this tragically. We've had to talk about kind of this ongoing and recurring theme of anti-Semitism that we see in the United States. And it's hard to think that we won't have to continue to talk about that. But I want to go, given our kind of theme today of justifiable force, there's been a remarkable reaction to that. A USA Today op-ed that was on Thursday of this past week actually said that they found it terrifying that so many church members were armed in that video. I mean, basically, the author, I don't have her name here in front of me, said, well, Jack Wilson really did something, really impressive there, but it's terrifying to me that we're armed this way. Other people, there was a kind of a very popular Twitter conversation in which the person said, well, listen, we can be impressed by this act by Jack Wilson, but he didn't follow the way of Jesus. Jesus would have never shot somebody.
Oh, boy.
I was asked about that on my weekly segment on the World and Everything in It podcast, and I kind of lost my cool, I think, in my answer to that. So I'm going to give it to you and say, it really fits into this conversation we're having about justifiable force, which unfortunately, it'd be great to live in a culture where that wasn't a conversation we needed to have very often, but it seems to be something not only on an international, national level, but on a personal level that at least some Christians are being confronted with.
Well, if you think churchgoers carrying concealed is scary, I'll tell you what I think is more scary is 26 people being gunned down on Sunday morning, as happened at First Baptist Church of Sutherland Springs about 2 years ago. The choice here in many ways is made for us. It's either you're willing to defend innocent life or innocent life is going to be taken. This is a moment where, thankfully, a tragedy that could have been a great deal worse numerically was averted by this one heroic act. There was John, there was an opinion piece to your earlier point about, Christians defending themselves and then what this says about our culture. There was an opinion piece in the Washington Post by James Moore that raised a few sobering questions, I think. He acknowledges that Jack Wilson is a hero, but he asked whether we should be celebrating that a church actually had an armed security detail to begin with. Not in the sense that he's questioning Christians' right to defend themselves, but that he's asking what this says about our society. I'm a Second Amendment guy like you, John. I over the Christmas break, I went shooting with my family. I believe in self-defense. I believe Christians have a right and even a duty to defend innocent life as part of that well-armed civil militia that our founders wrote about. And I don't think any of this contradicts Christ's commands to love your neighbor and turn the other cheek and so forth. And C.S. Lewis actually has a great section about this in Mere Christianity, where he talks about loving your neighbor, but also being willing to stop him in the midst of his attempt to commit violence in the context of warfare. But we can't ignore the sickness that this bespeaks in our society. We become a nation where a particular type of monstrous act is now a regular headline. Again, violent crime as a whole is way below historic levels right now, so we need to acknowledge that. We're statistically safer than we've been in generations, but we don't feel that way. And to some extent, I think it's rational, that's reasonable. Something about the way our culture and our values and institutions are set up right now is allowing too many individuals to become deeply evil or deranged and to act on it. And citizens are rational to carry around the means to defend themselves.
I would love to be an advocate of the Second Amendment because of the hunting argument, but that's not what the Second Amendment came from. And increasingly, as the culture shifts and changes, the reasons for arming oneself certainly changes as well. When I was asked about whether it was Christ-like, I thought, look, is it Christ-like, for someone to actually stand and to put one's life at risk in order to protect others and save others? That sounds exactly the definition of Christ-like to me, right? And that's exactly not only what Jack Wilson did, but the first two individuals who were shot. They were victims because they confronted the gunman and protected all the other victims that were in the process of taking communion. But your point, I think, Shane, is important, which is, listen to what I just said. They were potential victims while they were taking communion. Right. On Saturday night, these individuals that were attacked at this Hanukkah party were at a Hanukkah party, and 5 of them were wounded, 2 of them in the hospital in critical condition because of this. There is a sickness. I'll go back, too, because I think this will be a continuing theme heading into 2020. And in fact, in just about a week and a half or so, we're going to launch a symposium on our website with a number of Christian thought leaders on, what are the 4 or 5 issues going ahead into 2020. And I continue to think this kind of framework that we've offered of America at risk from, first of all, deaths from despair, suicide, addictions, and so on, but also acts of desperation, which, again, your stat, and we're going to come back to that violent crime is actually, fallen and is at low levels. But yet we have certainly a significant portion of the population willing to go into these acts of desperation, so many of them being young men. And the punchline being, hey, church, we are failing young men these days. That's got to be a continued concern. And in a way, I think, Shane, for the church to run into the plague. And that's something that we talk about here at the Colson Center a ton, which is the church is always at its best when it runs into the brokenness, not away from the brokenness. And that's what we saw from Jack Wilson. But I think on a corporate level, on a church level, we're going to have to run into the brokenness that is being created because we're failing to raise young boys into young men. And so many of the issues that we talk about and the deaths from despair and the acts of desperation are coming from that kind of seed point. And until we figure that out, I'm not saying until we figure that. I'm just saying the church has to figure this out because the church is called to deal with the broken. And that's a very, very clear expression of brokenness in our culture. Well, you're listening to Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. We'll be right back.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
Back on Breakpoint this week, John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Shane, we got just a little bit of time left here in today's program, and I wanted to have a conversation about something that I saw you post on social media, I think over the holidays, which, given the headlines that we've just spent the program talking about, would be maybe something hard to believe. And I think the title of the article from Matt Ridley at the American Spectator, we just had the best decade in human history. So we have these very sensationalist headlines, and I don't mean sensationalist like they're not accurate. I mean, we really did, take out an Iranian military commander in an act that could set off and trigger all kinds of other unforeseen consequences. There really were, attacks on religious folks over the weekend that were stunning. And yet this headline that on a whole lot of metrics, we can actually say things have gotten better in a lot of different ways. And you posted on it. I'm going to give you kind of first dibs here at explaining what this article said and why you think it was important.
Well, Ridley's headline was, "Don't let anyone fool you. We've just had the best decade in human history." He says this, that don't let anybody tell you that the second decade of the 21st century has been a bad time. We're living through the greatest improvement in human living standards in history. He says extreme poverty has fallen below 10% of the world's population for the first time. It was 60% when he was born. Global inequality has been plunging as Africa and Asia experience faster growth economically than Europe and North America. Child mortality has fallen to record low levels. Famine virtually went extinct in that time. Malaria, polio, heart disease, they're all in decline. So this is one of those moments when we have to, kind of put our thinking caps on, and I think acknowledge both the human condition and our dependence upon God, and then be thankful. And we talked a few weeks ago, John, just before Thanksgiving, about the situation of the early colonists in America. And there are few moments in the life of a community that you can say were bleaker than the moment that they faced there in the first year in the New World, having just lost, over half their population to cold and starvation. And yet, what did they do? They held a festival of thankfulness to God. They were recognizing the good that, that he had given them, the gifts from above, as James says. And I think we ought to do that. And objectively, if you look at all the statistics, whether it's, mortality or poverty or whatever, the world is actually headed in a very promising direction. And I always ask people who say, well, but what about this and what about that? Well, yes, there's still a lot of unconscionable amount of evil and suffering in the world. But I always ask, when was it better? What time can you point me to where there was this golden age where, people were better off than they are today? And I think the right response to that as Christians is to look and say, well, we should be thankful for this. And I got some pushback on social media about that, John, by people who are saying, in essence, well, yeah, that's great. The physical conditions of life have improved. But what about the spiritual condition? Look at how the West is just collapsing into spiritual darkness and debauchery. And my response to that was, well, the West is not all of the world. The United States makes up 5% of the world population. And the stats we have, from the growth of spirituality worldwide clearly indicate that Christianity is now more widespread than it's ever been. A higher percentage of people on earth are Christian now than has ever been the case. Tim Keller is real good on this. He talks about how Christianity is the first ever global religion. So, yeah, in the midst of all this, this bad news and all these dark headlines, I think there's a lot that we need to appreciate that often goes unnoticed because, as Ridley says, good news is no news.
And I think it's also important, Shane, though, that we also not say that this is a utopian narrative that you're telling, that just
right.
because things have so dramatically improved. And by the way, what's the source of that improvement? It's the growth of the market.
Right.
It's the expansion of economic freedom, which often comes on the heels of other kinds of freedom, specifically religious freedom. It's technological innovation, which is reflecting something deep about the human person, that we're made in the image of God and that we're able to not just be the problem, but also be the solution to our problem. It's one of those things after another. And all of that was exported out of the West. And all of those kind of impulses can be traced to kind of Christian first principles. And as you said, the majority world now is outside of the West. But what the West is feeding the rest of the world right now through sexual, the kind of is particularly through the sexual kind of reimagination of reality, is going to be stuff that could actually undermine all of that progress or bring in evil like we're seeing in America in a different sort of way, right? So this isn't an inevitability thesis. This isn't a, get on the right side of history, everything's getting better and better fantasy that you're pronouncing. There are reasons that the world is getting better and better, and there are ways that the world can get worse and worse, even while we have more stuff than ever before. Even while we're physically healthier, we can be spiritually more unhealthy than ever before, and that's not a sustainable path.
No, I'm no Hegelian. But I'll tell you what, John. I'll tell you what, John. I sure am glad that my kids don't have to worry about dying from some of the childhood scourges that used to sweep the world within the lifetime of my great grandparents. That's good.
And that's that's a really important observation. And yet at the same time, your kids are going to be exposed to ideologies that would have been unthinkable just 10 years ago, right?
Yes.
And that means, we don't live in a world that the fall has not touched. And yet at the same time, there's a lot of good news that we can celebrate, and that Christians should, again, as you put it, Shane, be thankful for. Well, you've been listening to Breakpoint this week. It's our weekly conversation about what's happening in culture from a Christian worldview. And one of the reasons we're able to bring a Christian worldview analysis each and every week to the conversation is because of our partnership with our good friends at World Magazine. And this month, during the month of January, we have a special deal in association with World Magazine for any gift over $25 to support the work of the Colson Center. You can get a year subscription to World Magazine for yourself, or if you already receive World, which I hope you do, you can actually give it to a friend or to a family member. To find out more, just come to breakpoint.org, breakpoint.org. For Shane Morris, I'm John Stonestreet. Thanks for joining us.